What's up, you sweaty nerds and greasy degenerates? Topaz will be releasing an Honkai Star Rail in the near future, so it's time to start pre-farming and getting our builds for her so that she's ready to go on day one. So here's the build guide for her. So let's just go ahead and jump into it so that we can start talking about her fat, juicy butt. Alright, so I'm going to briefly go into Topaz's kit so that we understand what we're going for with the build, relics, light cones, team comps, etc. If you already know what Topaz is going to be releasing with, skip ahead in the video if you so desire. I will be putting timestamps, so look down below if you want to skip ahead. Anyways, Topaz automatically applies Proof of Debt to a random enemy at the start of battle. Enemies with Proof of Debt receive 25% more damage from follow-up attacks, and Topaz and Numme deal follow-up attack damage regularly, so this totally works with the kit. Here's the thing though, if and only if another ally other than Numme attacks an enemy with a follow-up attack, Numme's action is advance forward, so Topaz wants to be paired with other characters that have reliable follow-up attacks like Herta, or like Kafka or Jingyuan, etc. Just so that you know, Proof of Debt, Topaz's skill, can reapply Proof of Debt to a new enemy, and so it's not set to random, and Numme will immediately perform a follow-up attack. This should work even if it's not being applied to a new enemy, so repeatedly attacking a boss with this should be fine. Topaz's ultimate causes Numme to get an increase in overall damage as well as crit damage. And this is the good part too, and if an ally attacks the enemy that currently has Proof of Debt, Numme's action is advanced forward yet again. Similar to Topaz's talent, only the ultimate buff state for Numme has no restriction. As long as they attack the same enemy that has Proof of Debt, you'll get that follow-up attack. So this will go off very often and will be very reliable, so it's advised to have a team that is fast around Topaz, so that even your supports and healers can give Numme those follow-up attacks. This means every member of your team is recommended to have a 134 speed stat or higher to give your team extra turns reliably. Having 134 speed gives your characters 2 turns every rotation every other cycle. This will help build energy for those characters, skill points, and priority opportunities over a slower team. And with Topaz, it will give you more follow-up attack opportunities, so all the better to build with speed around Topaz. And you don't probably need to build speed on Topaz herself, but we'll get to that later. Thankfully, Topaz is on the path of the hunt, so Topaz will be releasing with a very high speed stat, and she also has advanced forward effects in her kit, so Topaz, just like Seele, might not actually need to be built for speed at all. Seele, for example, gives herself speed buffs and sits around 144 speed without relic stats. Numme will regularly have its actions advance forward, eliminating the need for speed on many people's builds. However, if you want to build super speed Numme and hold priority giving her follow-up attack buffs, because that's what works for you and she is more of a sub DPS character for you, then don't let me stop you. It's just that speed isn't necessary for most people's builds, so just be aware of that. I'm not building speed Topaz as an example of this because of the speed buffs she will be getting. So let's look at the relics itself. Let's look at the main stats for relics. The body piece, I highly recommend going for either crit rate or crit damage, depending on what she releases with. Some of her traces might give her either crit rate or crit damage. We don't 100% know for sure, and depending on what substats you got, what relics you're using, what planar spheres, what light cone you're using, this will change what you need for a crit rate for the character. If you don't get good substats, you might have to use a crit rate body, but if you can manage, of course, use a crit damage body. What you choose will likely depend on your planar sphere as well. However, I highly recommend using Solsado. But anyways, we'll get to that later. For the feat, I recommend going with attack percent every time, unless you're that wild man building Numme. Speed Numme, then obviously build speed boots, but I wouldn't do it personally. I'd go for attack percent. As far as the planar spheres go, I recommend building fire damage. You can use attack percent as a placeholder if you need to, but I do recommend building a fire damage piece when you can. As far as the link rope goes, I recommend going for an attack percent link rope. Numme will be dealing so many follow-up attacks that you don't need energy regen rope, and I highly recommend using either Rudolent Arena or Solsado, but I recommend Solsado because Solsado has a 50% crit rate requirement for it to work. Rudolent Arena has a 70% crit rate. And the other thing is Solsato buffs follow-up attacks and ultimates. You're going to be getting your ultimate more often with Topaz and Nami than other characters, so you're going to be ulting them more often, and you're actually going to have those follow-up attacks. And the other thing about Solsato, though, is I wouldn't stop at 50% crit rate. I would try to aim for like 63% crit rate or higher. The cool thing about Rudolent Arena is that once you have 70% crit rate, you don't really need more than that for the most part. So at least 63% crit rate or higher. The higher the better. But don't, obviously use so much crit rate that you don't have enough crit damage. You kind of need this nice happy medium between them. Like I said, 63% or higher should do the trick though. If you need the extra crit rate because your substats are bad, you may need to use a crit body piece like I was saying earlier. But if you got good substats and have high crit rate, then you definitely want to use a crit damage body piece. Don't forget during Nami's buff state that she gets an increase in crit damage. So just, be aware of that and factor that in. So you'll definitely get a lot of crit damage off of her, so just make sure you're getting your actual crits. Now for the substats. Of course, we've been talking about it a lot. Go for crit rate and crit damage. And don't forget about attack percent as well. Nami technically has a DOT, so attack percent does help, and so does affect hit rate. However, it's uncertain what the base chance of this DOT effect that she has is, but consider some effect hit rate on her in the back of your head in case it's viable to help with DOT application. However, this is a very minor thing in comparison to your normal damage. She's not a DOT character by trade, so I wouldn't worry about this too much. Of course, DPS characters can benefit from break effect as well, and don't forget about defense. You don't want your DPS getting one shot in Memory of Chaos or Swarm Disaster, so roughly 3500 HP and 1000 defense should be good enough to not get one shot in most scenarios. As far as the 4-piece set goes for the bonus, I would recommend using the fire set. A lot of people are going to say, oh, the fire set on the fire character, well, in this case, it just so happens to work really well because the set was basically made for Himiko, who is a fire type character that deals follow-up damage, and Topaz is also a fire character that deals follow-up damage, so it just so happens to work really well. The 4-piece set increases the wearer's skill damage by 12%. After unleashing an ultimate, it increases the wearer's fire damage by 12% for the next attack, which will end up being Nami's follow-up attack. So the set works really well on Topaz. And you can also run the 2-piece fire set, 2-piece musketeer, stuff like that. And especially if you need a placeholder for something like a crit damage body piece or something like that to make your stats work well for you, because stats are more important most of the time anyway. And just so you guys know, I've heard that we're supposed to be getting a new Relics set potentially in 1.5. That's just what I've heard, so don't count your blessings too much. But if you're running really tough drops and it's a little bit rough for you, don't freak out too much because you may end up farming something else in the future. So using placeholder sets like a 2-piece of something and 2-piece of something else is totally fine for the time being. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and look into some light cones. First, we're going to take a look at Topaz's signature light cone. Just so that you guys know, this is not finalized. We do not know at this time what Topaz will actually be releasing with. This is just what we expect her to generally have when she releases, so I will be a little bit vague in this. Correct me in the comments if you have any more up-to-date information on this. Anyways, you've been warned. Let's take a look at it. So her signature light cone increases the wearer's crit rate and follow-up attack damage by a pretty significant amount, and after the wearer uses a follow-up attack, it will apply a stack onto the target, stacking several times. When allies hit enemies that have those stacks, every stack will deal increased amount of crit damage. So this is a pretty strong cone. It very heavily fits into her kit. It seems like it could also help other characters in the game that do follow-up attacks as well, but her kit is very heavily surrounding follow-up attacks, so if you do put this on another character, just be aware it might not synergize quite as well. Now, you guys have seen what we think her cone will be. Let's go ahead and move on to some other cones. Of course, a lot of people might be considering using the Herta Shop light cone, Cruising in the Stellar Sea. It increases the wearer's crit rate by 16% and increases their crit rate against enemies with HP less than or equal to 50% by an extra 16%. When the wearer defeats an enemy, their attack is increased by 40% for 2 turns. This is a pretty decent cone. It's really going to be dependent on what Topaz traces will be on release, whether this cone will be that great or not. If she already gets enough crit rate, then this is kind of like overkill for the crit rate potentially, unless you're really trying to reach a certain threshold or didn't get very good drops, then this light cone might work better for you. Just be aware this is a very accessible cone. Everyone can get their hands on this and everyone can take it from Superimposition 1 to Superimposition 5 very easily. But I do want to point out another cone that could work well, especially if her traces do end up slightly different than what we think they might be at this time. Sleep Like the Dead's a pretty good cone for her. It increases the wearer's crit damage by 30%. When the wearer's basic attack or skill does not result in a crit, it increases their crit rate by 36% for 1 turn. This effect can only trigger once every 3 turns. Now, most people will have this at Superimposition 1 because this is part of the gacha system. You can also buy this for a pretty high price in the shop as well, but it is harder to get your hands on this, so most people will have this at S1. That's why I'm reading S1 values. So again, depending on what her traces end up releasing with, Cruising in the Stellar Sea or Sleep Like the Dead are probably her 2 best in slots, besides her signature light cone. Of course, the signature light cone is usually the best, but I wanted to mention Swordplay as a really good runner-up as well. For each time the wearer hits the same target, damage dealt increases by 8%, stacking up to 5 times. This effect will be dispelled when the wearer changes targets. Now, a lot of people don't like this cone because you pretty much have to keep hitting the same target over and over for it to work. If you switch targets, the stacks fall off. So that kind of makes it a little bit rough, but don't forget that when you are using Topaz and Nami, you can only have 1 enemy with proof of debt at a time. So you pretty much want to DPS down that 1 target. She is a hunt-based character at the end of the day. She deals single target damage. So this cone actually does work with her kit. Once that 1 enemy is defeated, just switch to a new enemy. Now another runner-up that I don't think is all that good, but I guess I'll mention, is River Flows in Spring. After entering battle, it increases the wearer's speed by 8% and the damage by 12%. When the wearer takes damage, this effect will disappear. This effect will resume after the end of the wearer's next turn. Now, a lot of people will be able to get this to S5, so the speed goes up to 12 and the damage to 24, but I just don't think this is quite as good as some of the other cones. However, maybe at S5 this might potentially be able to outperform Swordplay. The only problem is that if the wearer takes damage, this effect will disappear. So this falls off if you take damage. That's probably going to happen at some point. So I personally don't really like this one as well. You need a shielder in order to make this cone work well. It kind of restricts you a little bit. I'd be looking at Sleep Like the Dead or Cruising in the Stellar Sea if it was me. Of course, you could also use your signature light cone. Alright, so let's go ahead and talk about some character pairings, kind of like team composition type stuff we can go for with Topaz. There's obvious things like buffers like Ting Yun, Branya, you know, the usual shtick, but that's not what we're interested in right now. We're interested in mostly that Proof of Debt with Topaz and Nami will cause the enemy with Proof of Debt to take 25% more damage from follow-up attacks, and Topaz and Nami will have follow-up attacks based on the amount of follow-up attacks that you are putting onto that enemy. So characters like Clara, who have a ton of follow-up potential, will be amazing pairings with a character like Topaz, because Clara can pop the heck off if she has the opportunity to use follow-up attacks. Now, it is a little bit RNG based because Clara would have to get attacked by the character with the Proof of Debt on them. However, in some scenarios, that's not too hard to get going. Now, a character like Kafka is DOT based most of the time, but you can build hyper carry Kafka, and the cool thing about Kafka's follow-up attack is that all you need for it to go off is you need to use a basic attack. So if you basic attack the enemy with Proof of Debt, Kafka will follow-up attack them once per turn, and most Kafkas are built for speed. So she'll be able to keep up with Nami, and Nami will be able to keep up with her. There's great synergy here as well, and it's very consistent. You can manipulate this every single turn. It's pretty darn good. Other characters like Himiko, of course, have follow-up attacks as well. However, you have to get a weakness break on the enemy for this to work. However, it is pretty good. You also have characters like Herta with follow-up attacks. One of the reasons why follow-up attacks are so good is not just because of the 25% extra damage. Nami and Topaz will do a follow-up attack of their own if you use a follow-up attack on the enemy with proof of debt. So you can like double up on your follow-up attacks with Nami. It doesn't have to just be with Nami's and Topaz's ultimate. You can get it from her talent as well, as long as you are getting follow-up attacks on the enemy that has proof of debt on them. So definitely something to consider there. Characters like Clara, Kafka, Himiko, you have Herta, you know, any character that has a follow-up attack that you can get going off consistently. I believe Seela's Resurgence can be considered a follow-up attack, so imagine having that on your team. And of course, how could we forget about Mid-Yuan? Mid-Yuan will be getting a little bit of a buff with Topaz and Nami around. To be honest, he doesn't really super need it. He is a really good character, it's just jokes, you guys. So put your character pairings and different other strategies in the comments below. Of course, I probably forgot about a lot of stuff in the video. Nobody's perfect, and I might be able to include them in the next video I do, where I do talk about team compositions for Topaz and Nami, where I'm able to go over buffers, debuffers, sustains, etc, etc. If you found this video entertaining or helpful in any way, shape, or form, please consider leaving a like and subscribe, and Topaz might let you touch her butt. Anyways, peace out.